Nicole Marcel, who is joining us from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She's a PhD student in art history at the Tyler School of Art and Architecture, Temple University. So Nicole, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much. My internet is not working so well today, so I'm going to actually stop video while I'm sharing my screen so I don't have any lagging. Can everyone see my screen? All right. My presentation is about placemaking in land. Thus, I want to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I currently reside in Philadelphia is the ancestral home of the Lenni Lenape people. I want to honor them as the original and current stewards of this land and offer my sincere hope that they are compensated for this stolen land. The word iconoclasm traditionally relates to the hateful or fearful destruction of imagery, leaving broken pieces and memories in its wake. However, with all of this destruction of imagery, in this kind of broken pieces and memories in its wake. However, with all this chaos, I am left wondering, is there another way to use iconoclasm as a method of restoration? Art historian Mia Mochizuki proposes using iconoclasm as a methodology, particularly to demonstrate the process of change. In that vein, I am suggesting the use of iconoclasm as a methodology to chart the process of change within an artistic series, but also to highlight artistic rejection of the past narrative and the possibility of a creation of a new narrative. In doing so, I am indebted to the work of not only Mochizuki, but also many Black feminist scholars who have helped shape the methodologies I use. In particular, the work of Tiffany Lethabo-King, Catherine McKittrick, and Dion Brand echo loudly throughout this paper. Sadia Hartman asks, how can narrative embody life in words and at the same time respect what we cannot know? The issue is particularly poignant in relation to the Black diaspora. The archive and traditional methodologies of art history are not the answer to Hartman's query. What's at stake then is the need to acknowledge and simultaneously reject the past narrative while forging a new narrative and structure in its place. We must attend to these narratives and stories from the colonial past while also rejecting and negating the story of the colonizer to create a new narrative structure in the present. There are numerous strategies for this work, but I am focusing on series as a method to reject the existing historical narrative and as a form of placemaking. An artist creating a series is in essence crafting a story, one that often changes course throughout the life of the project. Through series, Nyugen Smith creates his own archive. Since 2005, multidisciplinary artist Nyugen Smith has been working on an artistic series, Bundlehouse. It consists of over 50 works, ranging from mixed media and found object postcards, large mixed media maps on canvas, collages on wood panel, and found object sculpture, both large and small. The use of mixed media is important for Smith, evidenced by the prolific use of found objects in his work. Through his work, Smith creates new images and indeed new worlds. We can read this as a double act of iconoclasm, the traditional destruction or deconstruction of images, and the process of change in the life of the series as it transmutes from one type of media to another. Through the study of Smith's work, I endeavor to highlight the usefulness of iconoclasm as a method to chart change through the life of an artistic series. Furthermore, I argue that Smith's work is a form of placemaking, in which he utilizes material from the colonial archive to engage with, acknowledge, and reject the traditional narrative to form a new alternative narrative focused on the varied people of the Black diaspora instead of those who colonized them. For the purpose of this presentation, I will only cover 2 of the maps in the Bundlehouse series. In analyzing Smith's works, I draw broadly from religions and traditions of Africa and the Black Atlantic. Smith's art making is an amalgamation of items and media, referencing imaginary islands as well as real ones. He does not base his work solely on references from Haiti and Trinidad, from which Smith traces his lineage, but rather a utopian blending of the greater Black diaspora. These references belong to Africa and the indigenous Caribbean and provide the structure of placemaking through the recycling and reuse of ancestral traditions, as well as the creation of new traditions. Cartography has a long history in the African diaspora and Caribbean. Mapmaking was part of the colonial project in that it served as propaganda and a literal representation of why colonizers believed certain people needed to be enslaved, as well as a way of cataloging the land and people as a form of knowledge. Smith's maps simultaneously embrace and reject the colonial maps of the past, in that he engages directly with colonial imagery as well as African imagery. With his direct engagement of both languages of the map, Smith's maps supplant the colonial maps of the archive and remake the colonial unmaking of place. To inform my reading of these maps, I draw upon author Ishmael Reed's concept of necromancy, which he defines as using the past to explain the present and to prophesize about the future. I also look to Afrofuturism, which curator Ingrid Lafleur sees as a way to encourage experimentation, reimagining identities, and activate liberation. The first map I want to highlight is Bundlehouse Borderlines 3 Tribomartica. In this map, Smith is imagining and reimagining the Caribbean as an alternative narrative to the colonialist history of cartography. The traditional map names and identifying landmarks used by the colonialists to organize are here discarded to subvert and change those constructs into a utopian vision of place. To create Borderlines 3, Smith layered real maps of the islands of Trinidad, Cuba, Martinique, Haiti, and Jamaica, and created a fictitious island, banded together by the arbitrary nature of colonialism. Sections of the map are sewn together, highlighting the ways in which colonizers and slaveholders mashed together various indigenous and African people, regardless of their original geographic location, language, or culture. However, it also functions as a literal stitching together of people, bounded by circumstances and not necessarily identity, to show both the hybridity of Caribbean culture and a possible path forward. The stitching is in essence a triptych of functionality. It makes the map whole, allows for the creation of new place, and quite literally mends. This evocation of mending has multiple readings. It references the mending or healing of wounds inflicted by slavery, both physical and psychological, and also the concept of women's work. Women traditionally engage in both craft and sewing, and it is that sewing that fixes ruptures. Furthermore, in colonial society on the plantation, Black women were viewed as the fulcrum of slavery, in that they birthed more enslaved people, replenishing the forced labor force. It seems appropriate then that Black women's work in Smith's maps are the force that holds the utopian map and by extension community together. The compass at the bottom left of the map both resembles and diverges from a typical compass used by cartographers. While its function appears similar to existing maps, with the 4 cardinal directions denoted and an N for north at the top, the design choices reflect a move away from colonialist language and towards a new hybrid language of the African diaspora. The circle shape inscribed within the compass resembles both the divination trays of the Yoruba and also the Congo sign of the cosmos. The cross in the center represents boundaries, the horizontal between heaven and earth, and the vertical directs one either towards the heavens and the gods or toward the earth and death. It can also be read in a cyclical fashion counterclockwise, as a symbol of the nature of human life or the passage of seasons. Using the cosmogram as reference, water takes the place in the center circle, alluding to the ambivalence of the sea, both as a site of renewal and also of tear. When the open circles of the cosmogram are traditionally placed on the Western concepts of north, south, east, and west, Smith rendered his circles in liminal positions between those concepts. This appears to be a reference to the Congo concept of time, which is a direct contrast to the Western conception of time. These dots correspond to the in-between or small hours. Furthermore, this can be extrapolated to the idea of storytelling, as Obadele Cambon describes, in which the small hours correspond to distinct sections of the story, in this case, formulation, exposition or complication, denouncement or resolution, and reflection or internalization. Furthering this reading, the N at the top of the compass, originally thought to denote north, could actually be noon, at which human life is in adulthood or the story has reached its climax. In the possibilities of the compass, Smith offers an alternative knowledge system, one that is not predicated on the Western tradition. Also of iconographic interest is the cartouche in the middle left of the work. In Western cartography, cartouches serve as decorative elements. They often contain biographical elements of the mapmaker, as well as information about the literal ground the map covers. Smith's cartouche functions in a different manner, in that it explicitly references Caribbean stories and history. These images serve as a reclamation of the Caribbean, wresting away control from the colonial powers and firmly planting them back into the hands of the Caribbean people. However, we can also read them as a biographical element, albeit not as easily recognizable in the Western tradition. By referencing Caribbean stories and history, and through the endeavor of placemaking, Smith is placing his ancestral history quite literally on the map. In the cartouche, Smith depicts a woman sitting on a chair with a winged creature behind her, along with a barrel and sugarcane plants and a drum. The woman is partially nude and has one hoof foot and thick fur on her legs. She references a figure known in Trinidadian culture as La Diablesse. La Diablesse is traditionally known as a devilish woman who seduces unknowing men with her great beauty, leading them to death. She covers her one hoof foot with clothing, which Smith renders here as a fur blanket resting on her left leg. This story is used in Caribbean culture to coax children into good behavior, essentially a fable or fairy tale with a moralizing message. A carnival dragon is depicted behind La Diablesse. The dragon costume is one of the most popular figures during Carnival, representing multiple meanings depending on the context. It can be a stand-in for the devil or represent a force of nature. The creation of the dragon coincided with European arrival. Taken together, the dragon and La Diablesse reference Caribbean folklores and traditions, and Smith's use of them on the cartouche cements or fixes them on the map. In Bundlehouse Borderline 6, Smith utilizes similar imagery and techniques of placemaking. The triangular bones are repeated underneath the map and a cartouche is present. However, Smith's imagery has evolved and includes further references to French colonialism and African religions, as well as a flipping of the traditional narrative. The subtitle of this work is Imam, or the middle portion of remember with the R's removed. What is Smith partially remembering with these works? What are we, the viewer, supposed to remember? How do we evoke Reed's concept of necromancy and the idea of Afrofuturism, and remember the past while creating a new future or new path forward? Put differently, how can one make place while creating and viewing these works? The answer seems to lie in the subtitle. The past and future are invoked, but the important portion, the part that is visible, is the present. What exactly is present, both in the temporal now and also the physical work? The imagery in the top left corner depicts a plate resting on top of a plaid cloth in sequins. The plaid cloth grounds this imagery in reality, as well as physically grounding or fixing the imagery in the spiritual realm. In other works, Smith uses a checkerboard pattern to represent the floor of a church, remarking on the spiritual sound of walking upon these floors. Catholic church spaces came to be recognized as minkisi, or power objects, because they were associated with the power of the dead that lay beneath their floors. If we consider the plaid cloth as an extension of the checkerboard floors, we can evoke the sound of walking as akin to drumming during a ritual, perhaps one in which ancestors were called upon for guidance. On top of the fabric is a plate with sprigs of parsley and an upside-down fleur-de-lis. The fleur-de-lis is a popular symbol on French and Spanish coats of arms, but was also used as a brand on enslaved runaways. Furthermore, the symbol often appeared as part of a compass rose on a map, with the point denoting north. As such, Smith's use of the symbol upside down is twofold. It comments on the inability of the colonial map to reconcile European notions of space and location with the indigenous concepts of the same, as well as a reference to the fictitious cannibal imagery featured on colonial maps. By including an upside-down fleur-de-lis on a plate, Smith is playfully serving up the French to be eaten. Continuing along these lines, the cartouche also extends itself to the same type of dual reading with the fabric, plate, and fleur-de-lis. The compass lettering is reversed from the European tradition, with the N for north facing the left as a condemnation of European ways of denoting place as an erasure of indigenous concepts. The cherub figures have their hair styled in twists and are blowing horns in an act of heralding and celebrating the upside-down pig they are placed in front of. The pig represents a distinct reversal from the European maps, with images of indigenous people roasting other humans in an act of cannibalism. Smith's rendering again pokes fun at these tropes and rebukes them in an act of setting the record straight. Furthermore, the upside-down pig proclaims the beginning of the Haitian Revolution, of which the pig has become a highly recognizable symbol. On the right-hand side is a snake that winds its way down the canvas. Its body is entangled with a triangular bone structure, again present and ever present here. There are many serpents present in Caribbean culture, but Smith's use of the serpent likely coincides with the Haitian use of the Dahomean spirit Da, which itself is a blending of the Yoruba deity Oshimer. One of the main embodiments of Da is Da Aido Huedo, a rainbow serpent that enacted 4 pillars and the cardinal ordinances to hold up the sky. In Dahomean legend, Da Aido Huedo wrapped himself around these pillars as a support, and in Smith's version, the serpent wraps himself around the bones, evoking that, for the colonial project, the transatlantic slave trade was the pillar that propped up the world. At the top of the canvas, Smith includes a border of cosmograms or firma. Firma were used to consecrate the temple house before initiation ceremonies. Read this way, Smith's cosmograms make his canvas holy. The cosmograms may also represent veve, the act of drawing symbols on the ground in cornmeal by Vudun spiritual leaders. Still further, they could reference insibidi, a method of writing from Nigeria. As far as I can discern, the symbols at the top do not reference any specific insibidi. Rather, they approximate the idea of them. All of these references can be read as correct interpretations, just as there are many more readings. The purpose is to evoke African systems of knowledge in direct opposition to the Western traditions and archive. I wish to end with Smith's words rather than my own. When asked about his idea of a future Caribbean, Smith's response was in the form of a poem, evoking a utopia combined from the past, present, and future. When I think of the future Caribbean, I hear songs that have returned, songs of returning to that mythical place from where these songs have come. New songs, songs like prayers with a bell in honor of the wind and sea, the rain, the bush, and some they knew. Remembering through song the day and the hour when the future itself had come. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Nicole. I found that really interesting. I've never seen work like this before, and thank you for presenting that. So next we have Jaclyn Morgan, who is joining us today from Sauble Beach, Canada. She's a graduate teaching assistant and MA candidate at the University of Western Ontario.
Thank you. So my presentation is entitled #OctaviaToldUs and It's Time to Start Listening, Grappling with Climate Change and Ecological Sustainability in Parable of the Sower. Dystopian novels such as Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower engage in a unique discourse on climate change and ecological sustainability, offering a prophetic gaze into our collective future. According to current scientific data, climate change is predicted to disproportionately affect individuals who are already discriminated against due to their intersectionalities of race, class, and gender. Within patriarchal societies, women are at a greater risk as men primarily occupy positions of authority, which allow them to determine communal responses to environmental disasters, as well as the development of environmental policies. Furthermore, those who live in urbanized areas face increased exposure to environmental hazards as a result of excessive population density. These sources of susceptibility converge in Parable in a poignant depiction of the acceleration of slow violence, as Butler warns us of the danger of continuing on our current path of prioritizing capital over the welfare of our planet. Through the literary genre of Afrofuturism, Butler effectively collapses space and time in order to draw parallels between the antebellum slavery practices of the past and the expanding phenomena of debt slavery in the present. This parallel signals the alarming consequences of our current neo-capitalist practices, while also emphasizing the fact that systemic inequality is one of the largest threats to our society. While Parable sheds light on the darkest side of humanity, it ultimately presents a possibility of a brighter future, which promotes inclusive democracy and the empowerment of marginalized communities as the keys to combating climate change. After Donald Trump was elected to be the 45th president of the United States in 2016, dystopian novels from the 20th century, including Parable, skyrocketed to the top of bestseller lists as they were declared to be must-reads for 2017. Due to the policies of the Trump administration, especially those which have downplayed or denied the effects of climate change, Butler's prophetic vision of our current decade is unfolding at an alarming rate within our present reality. However, while novels of speculative fiction such as Parable clearly serve as a societal critique, they have also made vital contributions to cultural interventions concerning ecological sustainability. According to Hubert Zaff, literature is an archetype for civilizational self-renewal, as it manages to both subvert and enhance human consciousness and existence in rationalized modern societies. In addition to bringing awareness of societal dilemmas to a wide audience, aesthetic forms also have the potential to become sustainable cultural practices themselves, as they present alternative forms of dealing with the contemporary ecological crisis within longer-term perspectives of evolution and survival beyond short-term economic interest. Butler skillfully manages to capture this urgent need for human intervention in her writing, as the imaginative setting of Parable gives her the ability to make slow violence and portray its accelerated effects as she transcends time itself. Furthermore, since global environmental injustices have inordinately affected marginalized communities, elements of science fiction writing, such as Afrofuturism, give writers the means to amplify the nature of their inequality while also giving them a platform to express their collective concerns. While forms of slow violence, such as climate change, do not have instantaneous violent effects, which capture our attention through sensationalized media reports, the accumulation and the exponential acceleration of their incremental effects result in calamitous repercussions, which play out across a range of temporal scales. Consequently, Rob Nixon identifies one of the major challenges of battling slow violence, which he identifies as violence that gradually occurs out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, and attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all, as the inability to capture its delayed effects through pervasive stories and images, which could foster public concern and drive political action. However, by accelerating the projected effects of global warming, which result in California being engulfed in perpetual wildfires, a lack of clean drinking water, the privatization of essential resources, and the disenfranchisement of marginalized communities, Butler makes these disregarded sources of violence disturbingly real. While recounting the reports of the daily news, Lauren's father laments, "Tornadoes are smashing hell out of Alabama, Kentucky, Tennessee, and 2 or 3 other states. 300 people dead so far, and there's a blizzard freezing in northern Midwest, killing even more people. In New York and New Jersey, a measles epidemic is killing people, measles." Despite the fact that the novel is set in a dystopian version of our future world, these headlines are eerily relevant to our current decade, as increasingly severe natural disasters and a global pandemic have ravaged the human population. Moreover, slow violence presents the danger of compounding the pre-existing injustices tied to class, race, gender, and region. Women in particular are the main victims of slow violence. Farhana Sultana explains that climate change is a gendered process, which has larger implications for women when it comes to migration, adaptation, and the development of environmental policies. In the world of Parable, all of these difficulties directly affect the lives of female characters, as they are more likely to be assaulted or robbed while migrating to safer areas. They are often denied the ability to learn basic survival skills, and they are prevented from aiding in the development of sustainable strategies within their communities. However, one of the biggest impediments for the women of Robledo is their inability to achieve equal access to education. While Lauren's parents provide education to the children of Robledo, young girls in the neighborhood are often forced to give up their schooling when they become pregnant, while the Moss girls are completely denied an education by their father. As a result, they become confined to the domestic realm, which perpetuates their marginalization as they lose access to the financial opportunities that require academic qualifications. Chelsea Fraser argues that since this constraint is seemingly justified by the notion that women will always be protected by the men in the community, it effectively restricts their agency and leaves them vulnerable to environmental threats in order to maintain the structure of their community's patriarchal society. Ironically, while women who occupy a lower socioeconomic status are more vulnerable to the dramatic effects of climate change, they are also the ones who contain the most knowledge concerning what their households and their communities need in order to survive environmental hazards. Lauren insists that since the leaders of the community, such as her father, are trapped in a state of denial about climate change, the younger generation of women must act in order to evade the death sentence of their current lives. She explains that in order to survive, they need to educate themselves and to formulate escape plans in the event of emergency so that they can survive on the outside. However, despite the fact that Lauren's escape plan saved her life and allowed her to sustain herself outside of the formerly protective walls of her community, many of her neighbors lost their lives due to her father's refusal to allow her to formulate a collective evacuation strategy. Conversely, when Lauren later presents herself as a man, she is finally allowed to assume the role of a leader, which dramatically increases the chances of survival for herself and for the other members of her group. This shift in autonomy supports Sultana's main argument that in enabling women to take part in decision-making processes and having their concerns and voices heard, there are opportunities to reduce women's heightened vulnerabilities, thereby allowing them to better resist, cope with, and adapt to changes. This ability to adapt and shape change is a central tenet of Earthseed, which promotes the ideology that only when everyone is allowed to participate in the advancement of the community will its members be able to thrive. Doug Stark argues that Butler further accentuates the widening chasm of social inequality within our society through her creation of hyperempathy syndrome, which effectively dramatizes the violence of sociopolitical categorization and under the systemic devaluation of non-normative body minds, revises the liberal individualist notion of agency in favor of a model for collective activism. Hyperempathy syndrome compounds the intersectionalities of oppression as it becomes another debilitating affliction for those who belong to marginalized groups due to their gender, race, and socioeconomic status. Through the invention of a disease which amplifies the suffering of the oppressed, Butler causes the reader to develop their own type of hyperempathy syndrome as we become viscerally aware of the misery and suffering of the marginalized members of Lauren's world. In the field of cognitive cultural studies, literary scholar Hannah Wachowski and neuroscientist Vittorio Galeese had developed the concept of liberated embodied simulation, which indicates that the sharp distinction classically drawn between first and third person experience of acting and experiencing emotions and sensations appears to be much more blurred at the level of neuromechanisms mapping it. This means that when we are reading a novel, the perceptions and the emotions of the characters directly affects us, as our brains cannot distinguish between one's own body and that of another, even if that other person is fictitious. Thus, we are able to understand and feel the actions and the emotions that characters are experiencing as our immersion in their literary world enters into our brain's conception of reality. Our engagement with the text is also amplified by Patrick Hogan's notion of situational empathy, which suggests that by emphasizing with the character's situation, we can approximate the character's feelings and concerns, even if that character is different from ourselves. Therefore, even if the reader does not belong to a specific marginalized group, reading about their experiences, even if they are fictitious, provides us with an opportunity to understand their specific challenges within our society. Since science fiction novels such as Parable do not attempt to ground themselves within the realist tradition, the genre finds itself in a unique position to reveal the structure of our world through a critical lens. Hee-chan Ju explains that this strategy of staging a fictional narrative outside of the realist bounds of society in order to critique it is particularly resonant for understanding the concepts and workings of race. A category that is socially constructed yet produces real material consequences. Parable effectively foregrounds the continuing struggles of people of color within the Afrofuturist tradition by portraying various examples of violence enacted upon Black bodies, an issue which has reached cataclysmic heights in the present moment as police brutality has fueled global protests in support of Black Lives Matter. Alondra Nelson defines Afrofuturism as an aesthetic cultural movement which simultaneously references the past and imagines the future of Black life by using symbols and concepts of science fiction in order to imagine possible worlds in the visual, digital, and literary expression of Afro-diaspora cultural producers. In order to achieve this, Afrofuturist narratives such as Parable weave the past and the future together as a way of exploring alternate realities of the Black experience, which continue to be shaped by racism, oppression, and the legacy of slavery. As a result, they provide the opportunity for marginalized individuals to rise up as figures of hope, who have active roles in shaping their futures in a way that allows them to embrace their culture. Therefore, through this literary genre, the social hierarchies of our reality become destabilized through the abolishment of dominant myths about people of color, which have served as the basis for structural inequality. As one of the pioneers of the Afrofuturist genre, Butler expertly employs these techniques, as Parable's neo-slave narrative reveals that racial inequality, which began with U.S. chattel slavery, is still prevalent in modern American society. Through the stylistic tradition of Afrofuturism, the historical past is shown to intrude upon the present, creating an opportunity to revisit the whitewashed representation of historical events, while also using it as a means of critiquing contemporary society. Madhu Dubé proposes that Butler persistently revisits slavery in order to challenge the redemptive accounts of U.S. racial history that began to gain sway in the decades following the Civil Rights Movement. Ultimately, Butler does not allow America's national history of slavery to rest as a past era which has largely been defined by white narratives. Instead, she actively revives it in the world of Parable as a means of both exposing the legacy of inequality which continues to plague the Black community and of warning us of the possibility of its reemergence under the guise of economic servitude. While the global era of capitalism was hailed as one that would break down the borders between nations, it has merely resulted in the realignment of race and class stratification, which has deepened the divide of racial inequality. This regression is a central critique of Parable, as Lauren reflects that something new is beginning, or perhaps something old and nasty is reviving, once the city of Olivar is sold to a multinational corporation, marking a new era of debt slavery in America. The fortified estates of the wealthy serve as another extension of the antebellum period, as they consist of one big house and a lot of little shacky dependencies where the servants live, which mirrors the structure of plantations. However, while Bancole laments the state of the world as he remarks that this country has slipped back 200 years, Dubé argues that slavery in parable appears more centrally as a descriptor of the present than as a historical reference point, as it amplifies the racial discrimination which has been perpetuated by capitalist institutions. One major distinction between the practices of antebellum slavery and the form that's presented in the novel is that indentured workers are regarded as being disposable, as opposed to being seen as permanently owned property. Thus, slaves become expendable sources of unskilled labor, which are easy to replace during a period of mass unemployment. Furthermore, Butler's conception of slavery extends beyond the dichotomy of Black slaves and white owners, as all people of color are seen as disposable workers, while all women, including white women, are victims of sex trafficking. Nonetheless, it is important to note that the emergence of debt slavery in the novel is not a mere prophetic depiction of the future of the United States, but a direct reflection of practices which have been employed in third world countries for decades. For the past 30 years, America has led the world in neoliberal economic policies, unsustainable consumerism, excessive military investment and activity, and the consequential global environmental fallout from these actions. However, Nixon points out that Americans themselves remain unable to grasp the extent of the damage that their nation has caused, since the destruction has primarily been inflicted upon foreign countries and future generations. Therefore, rather than merely portraying the continued disadvantages of marginalized communities, such as higher rates of poverty, unemployment, limited access to education, etc., within society as a residual condition from the era of slavery, Butler emphasizes that structural inequality is an ongoing consequence of neo-capitalism. In Parable of the Talents, Butler directly explains the source of the pox as a combination of climatic, economic, and sociological crises, which were fueled by convenience, profit, and inertia, excusing greater and more dangerous environmental degradation. Notably, this apocalypse is not a global phenomenon, which results in the annihilation of the world, but a national event which results in the destruction of the United States as a first world power. In this instance, the collapse of the United States is depicted as a direct outcome of the nation's investment in an economic system which is predicated on racial exclusion through the continuation of the American legacies of slavery and colonialism. Consequently, Alexa von Mosner concludes that while it is not 2025 yet, and as far-fetched and extreme as Butler's speculative scenario of an anarchic, unjust, and unsustainable world may have seemed at the time of its publication, it becomes hauntingly premonitory as we approach that date. Through Butler's depiction of our current decade in Parable of the Sower, she reinforces the notion that dystopian fiction can become an effective means of confronting the reader with the dilemmas of reality, when the features of a speculative world are familiar enough to be understandable to the reader, and yet strange enough to point their attention towards something that they may have overlooked or taken for granted, such as the ongoing effects of climate change. While eco-literature has a unique ability to demonstrate the consequences of our unsustainable lifestyles, it also has a power to inspire social engagement with environmental justice, as it fosters a sense of empathy and moral responsibility within the reader. Moreover, unlike scientific data, academic scholarship, and environmental policies, fiction has the ability to influence a vast audience. As Butler weaves together the past, present, and future to create a dynamic depiction of marginalized experience, she creates a text which serves as a site of memory while also enabling the creation of a feminist future. While Lauren is initially cast as a marginalized figure who lacks the power to enact meaningful changes in her community, she transcends these limitations throughout the novel, becoming a prophetic figure who forges the path for a new way of life. Within Earthseed, the Books of the Living, Lauren declares that when civilization fails to serve, it must disintegrate unless it is acted upon by unifying internal or external forces. Consequently, in a world which is rapidly collapsing due to the inability of the American population to shape change, Lauren emphasizes the importance of diversity, as multiracial alliance becomes the only effective vehicle of oppositional agency. In order to make her utopian vision into a reality, she establishes the community of Acorn, which is built on the promise of the liberation from identity politics, the creation of an inclusive democracy, and the guarantee of equal access to education. Therefore, unlike the conservationists who seek to conserve environmental resources for the ultimate purpose of sustaining the economy and society as it presently functions, Lauren sees the structural collapse of her world as an opportunity to forge a new, sustainable life out of its ruins. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jaclyn. So next we will be going on to Catherine Mutune, who is joining us today from Bowmanville, Ontario. She's a mother and MA student at York University. Catherine, you can go ahead whenever you're ready.
Isyo kabuto buto buto nanga musinga musinga ndoke ngungengete. I don't think they understand our struggles. COVID-19 and African student mothers. I would like to tell a story. My story will resonate with most mothers, and yet unique, and highlights my struggles during the COVID-19 pandemic. I aim to make a case to higher learning institutions to review programs and policies that support marginalized communities. I would also like to argue that African student mothers are a unique minority community, and hence their struggles in higher learning institutions should be reviewed with an aim to support equitable access to resources. In the fall of 2016, I arrived at York University. Now, universities are usually quite big and intimidating, and you can bet that in the first few weeks, you might constantly get lost even after mastering your route. In those initial weeks, I seldom made it to class on time. I would run late trying to find my way around, sometimes entering the wrong classroom. This was the least of my worries. I remember walking into one of Vary Hall classrooms that accommodated more than 200 students, and I almost passed out from the anxiety that had gripped me. The looks on the students' puzzled faces as they stared at me, wondering where I had been all my life, was enough to make me turn around and call it off. Each and every step to my desk was torture, and I kept reassuring myself I'd feel better once I sat down. I did not. I felt awkward all through. I did not want to talk to anyone. Well, maybe they probably thought I was the lecturer. I found it hard to make friends, and I wondered if I would survive. Being older than the other students, being on a different platform, being a class to pick up her kids, and being on culture, I felt judged and unfitting. Moreover, as a minority, I felt like I was invading their space, even though it was a learning institution with diverse persons from every background. Most of the time, I struggled to understand what the professor said. Many of them spoke fast, and by the time I understood what they had said 5 ahead, leaving me lost and confused. I was always hesitant to raise up my hand to answer a question, even when I knew the answer, because I lacked the courage and confidence to do so, and I feared I could not articulate my answers like other students did. Neither did I ever raise my hand to ask the professors to repeat themselves, out of fear of appearing stupid. I thought no one would find my project's ideas worthwhile. Heck, I didn't even know how to articulate those ideas in front of my cohort. There were too many assignments to complete, and for me, the load was doubled since I had to read and reread to understand. I did not grasp lectures like other students, and even after reading the same materials provided in my quiet corner, of the classroom, I would question if I'd gotten the materials mixed up, since the translations provided by the students sounded different. As much as I put on a brave front, I was struggling inside, fretting that I had made a huge mistake enrolling to a higher learning institution, thinking that I would make it. Well, that was me in my undergraduate degree. Things have changed since then, but I find the same insecurities creeping up on me all the time, thinking I'm not smart enough, being older, having language limits, being a minority from a lower class, and seeing situations from a different lens are some of the barriers I continue to face. Even though I eventually made a few friends who are mothers as well and share the same struggles of motherhood, our cultures respectively present us with different perspectives on how to handle different situations. Our roles are different. How we learn and associate with each other is different, and our languages are different. The first day of class as a graduate student and the preceding days for some months were some of my most challenging days. I shared the class with students who were either pursuing their second master's degree or were PhD students, and just a handful of first year masters like myself. I felt so small, and it was grueling to attend class every evening. I understood and knew very little. The reading assigned were complicated, and the discussions in class intellectual, and the presentations stellar. The one thing that kept me going was the relationship I had developed with my professor. One evening, after battling with myself long enough, I mustered every bit of courage I could and dragged my legs to his desk after everyone had left. "Sir, how do you think I'm doing?" I muttered. "What do you mean, Catherine?" I told him I felt out of place, and despite reading and rereading the assigned articles, I still failed to understand the lessons. The professor was very understanding. The weight was lifted off me. From then on, every day before class began, we would catch up on the lessons. He would ask me some questions related to the day's class, and he simplified what was difficult for me. In addition, I joined a study group that scheduled meetings at the library to study together, and it worked out pretty well. Slowly, my uncertainty was replaced with refreshed determination. The study group and the relationship with my professor sustained me until COVID-19 struck. The pandemic couldn't have hit at a worse time. Mid-March, after March break, I felt this period was going to be hard. Schools extended the break for 2 weeks, and immediately after that, a total lockdown in the province followed. With my folders full of assignments, papers due, and presentations pending, I knew it was going to be really challenging. My 2 boys, 10 and 5, were in subsidized daycare all day, which gave me enough time for school and few other things in between. But now, we were all at home. I had no idea how I'd manage these energetic children, housework, and schoolwork. We have 2 laptops to share amongst the 4 of us, 2 kids and 2 parents. And with classes everywhere, having been switched to online, I have to sacrifice my day study time for my children and let them use 1 laptop while my partner works full-time with the other laptop. When I have an online class, I log onto my phone and lock the door to my room for some privacy. But for some reasons, my kids have to check on me every 15 minutes. Just when I have settled down to some serious study, their curious voices come through the door. "Mama, what are you doing?" Just when I'm in the middle of a Zoom class, feeling very intelligent, answering a complex question, they barge in like a SWAT team. "Mama, we are hungry." And just when I finally find a way to keep them quiet, by allowing them to watch cartoons, the loud fights and screaming begin. When we have dinner and it's time to get them to bed, I'm happy that I'll eventually get some me time and catch up on those assignments. Or so I think. The noisy children are finally tucked in bed and fast asleep. At last, some peace and silence. I quickly clean up the rooms and put away the dirty laundry. It's 10 p.m. I sip a cup of coffee and enjoy the tranquility, as if I'm on a vacation on a calm tropical island. Suddenly, I catch a glimpse of my laptop, patiently waiting for me. I think of all the writings and readings that I have to finish before turning in, and the thought of it alone makes me feel exhausted. I reluctantly reach over, switch on the laptop, and promise myself I'll read at least one article. But as soon as my eyes are fixed on the glaring screen, they become heavy. I feel tired, and the coffee is not keeping me awake. I flip through a few pages and get the general idea of the subject before I call it a day. I will wake up early and catch myself up before class begins. Every class reminds me how hard it is to have an online session when I'm still grappling with language challenges. I know you may think that I speak quite good English and communication should not be a problem. But coming from Africa, it's obvious that I'm not proficient in Canadian English. Rather, I'm fluent in Kenyan English. With Canadian English, I do not easily understand what one says unless they speak slowly with clear enunciation. I find that if they speak too fast, I'm unable to follow. My secret solution to this before the pandemic was to sit right at the front of the class so that I was quite close to the professor's face and I could pay close attention to his lip movement. And that way, I could make up and understand what he was saying. Still, after class, I would always have a question for him. The reverse is quite true with my Kenyan English. Most people don't understand what I say because of how I pronounce my words. There's quite a bit of miscommunication between us. Plenty of, excuse me, what did you say? And many corrections and apologies for my tongue. It is more apparent in a classroom setting where at times I'm the only one with an accent. My listeners seem to pay more attention to my accent than to my message, often interrupting me to ask, "You have such a lovely accent. Where are you from?" Hence, being conscious when speaking. With these language limitations, I lack courage to speak, to write, and to present efficiently. Consequently, questioning my ability to be an outstanding student. And this is the point where I feel face-to-face interactions with my professors and supervisors boosted my confidence. I would present an idea or ask a question that would in turn turn into a conversation that encouraged and pushed me to think harder and broader in spite of my predicaments. Now that I have to figure out what I don't understand through the screen by myself, I appreciate more the extra work and hours after class that my professors gave me. Not much can be done about the language barrier. After all, they say when you go to Rome, do what the Romans do. But it will be helpful and welcoming if others learned about where immigrants come from, their cultures, languages, social, education, socioeconomic, and political histories, as well as the prejudices and the challenges they face in foreign lands. For instance, I feel alone, segregated, and misunderstood. Firstly, because I don't have a social support system. And secondly, because I come from a different education system. These struggles seem to be exacerbated through this pandemic and the socioeconomic hardships and lack of of human social capital have particularly made it extremely difficult for me. It is my hope that my story will elicit conversations that will aim to rethink how African student mothers can be supported. And in the words of Mary Maynard and June Purvis on researching women's life from a feminist perspective, they assert that life stories are an excellent source to explore these accounts that are full of silences. Tapping into life stories is one way of listening to what the silences mean and moving on towards positive change. Problematize these experiences, refuse to normalize struggles, but rather establish cultural-based communities in higher learning institutions. Waidanje wamuleso, waidanje wamuleso, koendie kondoye, waidanje wamuleso. And this is my story. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that recording, Catherine. Would you like to speak a little bit more on your presentation?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. When I think of the theme of the conference and looking at all the factors that informed the theme, I thought this was really a good chance for me to show all the viewers that there's a small group of minority women who remain invisible, and it's almost like we are not there. And these struggles are not only for students. You can imagine professors who have families and are going through similar challenges, and yet we choose to just brush over it and, you know, think that everybody has gone through it. And that's why I thought there's need for these conversations to start taking place, so that we don't feel invisible, number one, and we don't feel like we are going through this all by ourselves. There are so many, when I say this, I don't mean to devalue other students and the work that also other students go through other struggles as well. But I think more importantly, I speak for myself, and I think other African mothers who are students or professors or whatever, wherever you are, life stories are so enriching in bringing out our voice and our agency and trying to find solutions to some of these struggles.
Great, thank you so much. So we're actually in our Q&A portion. So if any of the attendees would like to ask our panelists questions, you can go ahead and unmute yourself or raise your hand actually, or you can drop it in the chat box. I can give you guys a couple of minutes to just recoup and ask your questions. But I could start off. Catherine, I did have a question for you. So do you think that schools, like, what do you think that schools can do to be more inclusive of students with different backgrounds? Because I think a lot of times when we think of students, we think of young students, ones who are following the path that we kind of enforce on us. But, you know, I'm sure you took a break in between with having children and everything. So how do you think schools can actually help you in that way?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. So my research study is actually on immigrant African women, and specifically those who came through the Federal Skilled Work Program. And I get inspiration from my own experiences and the challenges that I've gone through. And this is because I almost found myself all by myself, because I did not catch up with everybody else at the same pace. If I got friends who are women and mothers in my same cohort, they were probably Canadian born, right? So while we were struggling with education, all of us, when we look at the factors that were compounding to all those factors put together, I found that I was struggling more. And now back to your question. York University and any higher learning institution is constituted of a variety of students. It's almost impossible to narrow down and say, this is how we are going to support mothers. This is how we are going to support young Black girls and women. This is how we are supposed. So usually I find a lot of empowerment in creating communities with similar cultural backgrounds for support. So in the interdisciplinary studies program, the director actually has put together a group of African alumni students just to support the academic bit, because even at York University, there's a great support system. We have the wellness program. We have different cultural groups. We have the Nigerian, we have the Muslim Association, those groups, but they seem to have a blanket programs that address that try to help as many students as possible. So when you have these small groups that are really struggling, like mothers, Black recent immigrants who are either struggling with language or they are struggling economically, then you don't have then we find ourselves left out. Like, for example, before COVID struck, all the workshops that I really wanted to attend were usually done in the evening. Now, 7 o'clock, 6 o'clock, I need to be at home with my kids and cook dinner and do homework and all that kind of stuff. So that's why I have such a passion for my research work, and I'm hoping that other women don't have to go through what I'm going through, or at least make things a little bit better. Thanks. Sorry for taking so much time.
No, that's not a problem. Thank you so much for sharing. And I look forward to seeing your work and reading your work. So if anyone has any questions, you can drop. I'm sorry, I'm just going to look at the chat box really quickly. I don't see any hands raised. Okay, so I guess I'll continue with my questions. Jaclyn, I did have a question for you. So I don't know if you've really done field work, but at a community level, how do you think people are able to combat the issues of marginalizations within like political ecology? Because I think it's a topic that a lot of people don't discuss. And it's very important because especially with COVID-19, I think there's a lot of impacts that these communities feel that we just neglect, I guess.
I feel like one of the biggest things is making it accessible, because I mean, a lot of things that go on, like kind of like at these conferences or in like academic literature isn't really accessible to the wider population who might be dealing with these issues. So that's why I thought it was wonderful in somebody like Octavia Butler to write a fiction novel which could reach a wide audience and make these issues accessible. So maybe if we did that a little bit more by trying to like put these messages into popular culture, and kind of like Catherine said, like building like smaller networks towards sustaining like more long-lasting change. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much. I'm just looking for questions.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course, yeah.
My question is for, I'm gonna butcher this name, Jaclyn? Jaclyn?
It's Jaclyn, but that's okay.
Jaclyn. Yeah, so I read Octavia Butler's book when I was in my third year, The Parable of the Sower, and it's just one book that you cannot put down. But in it also, there was a lot of violence, if I remember. Could you kindly speak a little bit on that? I know it's a lot about climate change, and I remember part of it was preserving. The way she portrayed preserving the environment was she had these seeds that she had put in her bag just in case of anything, but there was a lot of violence, and I was wondering if you could just speak into that a little bit.
Yeah, I think what Butler did a really good job of was like showing things that are already present in our reality, like violence towards people of color and violence towards women, and kind of amplifying it on a greater scale to put commentary into it. Because I mean, when women are out in the world in Parable of the Sower, they're really likely to be like assaulted or sexually assaulted or robbed. And people of color usually also have like hyper empathy syndrome, which is something in the book she created where if you see somebody in pain, you feel that pain yourself. So that was also how they like kind of started slavery again by taking advantage of those people. And it was just really, I found noticeable that the only people who had hyperempathy syndrome were marginalized, whether they were women or people of color. So I think that like all of the violence in the novel was kind of like accumulation of what she was seeing in the world around her and just like wanting to make a comment on that.
Sorry, I thought I was not muted. Nicole, I actually had a question for you now. So how did you get into the work of art? Because I think that's such an interesting way of looking at decolonization. So I was just wondering, especially as like as a young person, right? And I don't know if you have any background in the Caribbean or anything, but how did you get into that specific area of study?
I took a class my first semester, and I actually did not know a ton about Caribbean art, not widely taught in a lot of schools, unfortunately, and now it's kind of becoming a little bit more mainstream, which is great, and just became really interested in it and seeing a lot of really interesting artists working within the Caribbean and Caribbean traditions. I'm also really interested in artists utilizing religion in ways that aren't necessarily specifically religious. And there are a lot of Caribbean artists who are doing that. So there's a lot of kind of parallels to my own work. So I've been very much interested in some of the artists that are working in the Caribbean.
Have you been able to like meet any of these artists or speak to them or anything? No.
Not yet, just because of COVID. I have talked to some of them. I talked to Nyugen Smith just on Zoom and through email, but I have not had the opportunity to meet anyone in person yet, hopefully soon.
That's really interesting. Thank you. So if anyone has any questions, I think go ahead and drop in chat again or raise your hand. I feel like everyone's really tired from the day's events. Not sure. So I think we can wrap it up earlier if everyone's feeling okay. I'm just gonna wait and see if anyone has any comments to make. But okay, thank you guys so much for presenting today. It was very insightful, very wonderful. And I look forward to seeing more of your work. And if you guys would like to share anything for your final words, you can go ahead. Good. Okay, thank you guys so much for being here today. Have a good day, everybody. And also for the next event, we will be having, I think we are going into a roundtable right now, actually. Let me just make sure.
Thanks, Nishana.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you so much for coming out. Yep, so we will be taking a short break from 3:30 to 4 p.m. And then there will be a dialogue on anti-Black racism with Evelyn. And then there will be social rooms for anyone who's interested. So thank you guys so much for being here today and have a wonderful day. Thank you.